Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new episode of the In Production podcast. And today we have an amazing guest, Tamara. Please tell us more about yourself and why should people listen?
Hey, Nick, welcome. I'm so excited to be here. So, I have spent my last 20 plus years in the healthcare industry and really at that epicenter of organizations that turn strategy into execution and execution into measurable results. So, as a vice president, strategic execution leader, what I've seen is that product minded, delivery focused approach to solving complex business problems. It's really that where I sit and what I love to do is bring all of those connection points, product, engineering, operations, enterprise stakeholders together to move from concept to implementation to adoption and value realization.
It's
So I
amazing.
am super excited to be with you here today.
I would love to unpack those learnings for our listeners and for the viewers. The first question is going to be exactly about that. So you've been, um, I've read a little bit on Lumeris, and you guys are very active in terms of deploying AI right now into the healthcare. And as you have seen this motion with AI evolve for the last 8 years, what was your main learnings in those 8 years about AI transformation? How is it changing business? How is it evolving business? Because you have been seeing this thing from the company perspective inside out, and this perspective is super valuable. No consultancy agency, no big four really know what is it feeling that transformation over the 8 years, because they have been consulting all the way down. So I'm super curious, what are your learnings? What were your main observations in the last 8 years about AI and transformation in healthcare, in your business?
Yeah, great question. Living 8 years inside of a system teaches you that AI transformation, or really candidly, any kind of transformation, is never just a technology story, right? It's a workflow story. It's a trust story. It's a measurement story. It's an operating model story.
Hmm.
So a consultant can usually identify opportunity areas and they're magnificent at it, right? But where they often don't live long enough within the organization is to see where the real friction shows up.
Hmm.
That rarely makes a slide deck. And it almost always is in the handoffs, right?
Mm.
In the exceptions, in the behaviors, and the points where people quietly stop using the system.
Hmm.
So when you're inside the organization long enough, you see the difference between the process, where a process is documented and how it actually runs. You see which leaders say they want standardization, but still reward heroics.
Hmm.
And you see where data is directionally useful, but not yet decision grade, right?
Right.
And you learn that the real work is not deploying AI.
Hmm.
It's building governance, readiness, and measurement discipline that gets the organization to absorb the change without creating a bigger mess.
Hmm.
So, in my opinion, the biggest lesson is AI or any sort of massive transformation, only creates value when the organization has the operational maturity to support it.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you're just really accelerating inconsistency.
Yeah. If you put inconsistency in, the AI is just going to be your multiplier. So whatever you're putting inside, you will just going to get more of it. So if you give more complexity, it will scale the complexity. If you give it clarity, it will scale clarity. And one of the things that you also mentioned was governance. Governance is very important. Like even in my professional day to day, I speak with a lot of teams, and in some of those teams, their governance policies could be improved a lot because they tend to limit the growth. But in some of them, the governance policy are great because they prevent the company from doing unnecessary risks. And at the same time, they not limit innovation, but they actually support innovation and they actually fuel innovation. I'm curious, in your experience, when was the moment when you built the governance structure and it actually stopped bad things from happening and it was still enabling good things to be processed, evolved, the governance policy that is still a guard for the main core of your business, and the system works, the lights are working, but
Mhm.
I'm curious, what does it take to build that kind of governance problem that still prevents bad things to happen, but allows good things to still be deploying?
Yeah, great question. So I think the real test of governance is whether it works when the pressure is the highest and the people want to bypass it. Right.
Hmm.
So think about those very acute situations. Governance can feel in an acute kind of triage sort of scenario, governance can feel like a bureaucratic overload. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
So to me, I think about a moment that stands out where we had an initiative that had strong early enthusiasm. But once we pushed it through like a structured review, the numbers, the dependencies, the readiness picture, it just didn't hold up to the way the original narrative suggested.
Hmm.
Right. So, in absence of governance, it most likely that initiative would have continued on momentum alone
Hmm.
because no one wanted to be the person to slow it down. Right.
100%.
But the framework forced the right kind of questions. Questions like, what problem are we actually trying to solve here?
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
What's the measurable business case? What are the operational dependencies? What's the capacity that we're displacing? And what does success really actually look like? And so, because we asked these questions and had to answer it in a disciplined way,
Hmm.
leadership had enough visibility to pause and reframe rather than continue funding something purely on optimism and political energy alone, candidly.
Okay.
So what it cost to build was not just time, right, Nick? It cost pushing through resistance. It cost making people sit in more rigor than they initially wanted. And so governance sounds clean in hindsight, but while you're building it, it can feel really inconvenient. It can feel political. It can feel slower than anything that you want to do, right? But the payoff is that you avoid expensive motion that looks productive, but actually is misaligned.
So, in simple terms, if I'm understanding correctly, the good governance is essentially before we make a big move or make the move that has some weight, we need to go through a certain type of questions that we have defined for ourselves. Because sometimes, especially if there is an charismatic executive that is leading an initiative, he can
Hmm.
be or she can be all the way in that initiative. And this stands the ability to forget about those initial things that the whole company is operating on. And just to bring everybody on the same table where the whole company works, you just need to ask those questions. And then those questions will actually tell you, is that initiative should be done or shouldn't
100%.
be done? Okay.
100%. So it's not sexy, right? But
Hmm.
what good governance does is it eliminates the emotion, right? It becomes a mathematical exercise, right?
Hmm.
These
Hmm.
are the foundational questions and tenets that we're going to measure ourselves against, agnostic of who is bringing the initiative forward, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And that data then is usable to make the decisions. Again, done well, done right, and done in a repeatable, measurable fashion,
Hmm.
it really just gives a foundation in which you have a comfort and a clarity on how a decision framework that just doesn't allow or enable kind of political capital and the give and
Hmm.
take that comes from that sort.
Well, I'm sure that this model for the governance that you described, it's like one of the cornerstones for the success that you had at Essence Healthcare that you have been shaping because you've been earning like 4.5 and 5-star CMS ratings. And this is like extraordinary result. What does it actually take to not just build once, but also maintain that kind of performance, consistency for all underlying operations, especially when you add AI adoption to all this mix, it can be a very dangerous cocktail.
Yeah.
So what is your recipe for success for keeping that consistency and then still
Yeah.
pouring and sprinkling the AI innovation on top of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an amazing team that leads that, right? Like incredible leaders that I'm sure many people are familiar with, the Lisa Pattisons and the Jen Weiricks of the world. But what I think those leaders have done incredibly successfully is they've built a discipline at the operating model level,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, just like I do, in Medicare Advantage environment, you don't get to confuse innovation with permission to be sloppy, right? The regulatory stakes are too high. The quality measurement system is just too unforgiving. So, when tooling is still immature or AI adoption is early, the answer, in my opinion, is not to romanticize the technology. It's to build stronger safety net around it, clear governance, defined escalation paths, human oversight when needed and where necessary,
Hmm.
KPI discipline, and a very honest understanding of where the process is stable enough for automation and actually where it's not,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So the organization, those leaders, what they've, I think, nailed and done magnificently is maintain performance consistency um, by assuming that not all the tools are going to save them, right? They do it by protecting the integrity of the underlying workflow
Hmm.
while layering on new capabilities carefully and judiciously. So, they're not, um, not that anybody would, most likely handing their stars performance over to an unproven tooling or processes and hoping for the best.
Hmm.
So they are in the place of earning the right to trust technology by building the controls first,
Hmm.
then working through automation and optimization of a technologically enabled and optimized solution.
This is gold. Which brings me to the kind of like the follow-up question. So you right now already have built the KPI and executive reporting framework across, is it 440 million portfolio?
Yeah, I did that at a previous organization, not at actually Essence. But yeah, I built that framework. Yes.
I'm super curious. So when you have this AI initiative, in the beginning everybody's excited, but it's a marathon. So in the mid cycle, let's say the deployment and the leadership wants to know um, how we're going with the AI adoption. Is it actually working? Are we
Mhm.
seeing the results, or are we seeing the beginning of the results of the ROI that we invested, and now we're interested what's coming out from that investment? So what kind of recommendation would you give to leaders that are listening to this that want to avoid reporting a number that tells a story that the data cannot actually tell, because everybody's excited and you're excited and you don't want to overexcite on the data that you can't actually prove because you don't know what's going to be at the end of this initiative?
So true. So true. So, again, I feel like I'm using some of the same words, but I believe in them and I think they're absolutely appropriate. But when an initiative is mid cycle, you have to be incredibly disciplined about separating activity, leading indicators, and validated outcomes,
Hmm.
right? So, using the scenario you gave, what I report at that in that mid level stage, that early mid to mid level stage, is usually a combination of adoption signals, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Workflow performance, exception rates, productivity trends, issue volume, readiness indicators, and if there's any variance from the
Hmm.
original business case
Hmm.
assumptions. I think it's exceptionally important to not overstate cause and effect too early, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
If the data is still directional, then say it's still directional, right? If the ROI is not mature, we shouldn't, and certain folks don't pretend that it's proven. I think one of the biggest mistakes that leaders make is taking an early positive signal and narrating that it's finished,
Hmm.
right? It creates false confidence, it weakens trust in the data when the data stabilizes later on, right?
Hmm.
And it stabilizes differently.
Yep.
So I personally try to give leadership a very truthful view of what we know and what we don't know, and what the leading indicators look like, and what is promising, and what still needs to be measured over time.
Hmm.
The key takeaway here is that good reporting doesn't just provide numbers, it should provide integrity around what the numbers actually mean and
Hmm.
how that trending is moving, what to do in that liminal space, right?
Hmm.
And that, I think, takes, a degree of maturity across the organization. It generally is not a comfortable place, right? Because you want more, and sometimes it's just not possible.
It feels like you're kind of drawing a map and you say, hey, we left here, we're point A, we're going to point B. Right now we're here. And it's we're gonna be there in a week's time, or like, because
Right.
it takes the time to do the road, to do the steps, or it's natural. So it's very important to say, okay, we left here and here we are, and this is where we're going. But you're not selling at that point that, okay, tomorrow we're gonna be at the point B, because that's humanly impossible. You cannot teleport there yet.
Correct.
What about a conflict, a natural conflict where you have governance and then you have speed? Sometimes something urgent happens and
Hmm.
you're in a very highly regulated environment. So how do you walk around governance if you need to do something fast? How do you marry those two? Sometimes it looks like they're confronting because, as you said, in the governance, you need to take a step back. How do you deal with the situation that require instead, like, you need to move very fast? Are you proponent for the thing that if something is urgent, it can never be important, or how do you see it?
Yeah. Yeah. I do live by that, if everything is important, nothing is important, right? That old standard. But I think what you're describing is a very real dynamic, right? It's very real. And I think, especially when you have a high priority initiative that gets executive momentum, right? Let's be clear, timelines tighten. And suddenly people start treating governance as optional because it feels like friction,
Hmm.
candidly.
Hmm.
And so the language, it can be a possibility where the language starts to change from, hey, let's validate this, to like, we already know what's needed, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
in my opinion, that's where the danger zone it begins to be entered, right? So in a Medicare Advantage plan, that instinct is particularly risky because speed without controls
Hmm.
can create some very real downstream issues in compliance and operations, member experience, quality performance.
Hmm.
So when pressure came from above, my job was not to be obstructive, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
It was to be clear about what had to be true about speed for speed to be safe, right? So that meant reframing governance not as a bureaucracy, but as a risk visibility, dependency management, protection against preventable failure.
Hmm.
Sometimes that required saying things like, we can move fast. We absolutely can, but only if we're honest about what it is that we're not yet validating.
Hmm.
Or, we can accelerate, but here are the controls we need to preserve X, Y, A, and B. So I don't I don't subscribe. I don't believe good governance should kill speed. I don't. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
Think I think what is important, and candidly, really good governance keeps speed from becoming reckless.
Hmm.
And so I think they're actually quite harmonious, but it can feel uncomfortable when the need is to solve, and some of those, and that checks and balances of, okay, we will choose to execute in absence of, and fill in the blank, right?
I see. I understand better the relationship with the speed. What about the relationship with another very interesting thing, which is a workaround? Because you have experience that I'm sure there is tens and hundreds of companies right now that are actively exploring this. They that are thinking about, how do we do AI-enabled assistance for our executives or for a specific department? Because that most of the value should be coming from for a lot of companies right now. So you already had a successful experience in your past of building or and being a part of this kind of project. What was the gap that you discovered? Like, here's documented workflow, but here is actually how people were doing the job. This is how they were making decisions, and that stuff that lives in their head. It's a hard thing to grasp. It's almost impossible. So, what did you learn when you were doing this program about this gap between the process and knowledge that humans have in their heads, the tribal knowledge? What was the main realization
Yeah.
that you had?
That's that's so good. That experience of knowledge is currency, right?
Uh-huh.
So What was really fascinating was the assumption that the documented workflow, as we started this, right,
Hmm.
it was looked linear and consistent. But then the real decision making as the workflow executed was much more interpretive
Hmm.
and variable and dependent upon, manager or subject matter, expert judgment, memory, writing ability, and confidence. It had all of these, external factors, if you will.
Hmm.
And candidly, that was the real gap. So, what going through that exercise, what it revealed is that, nobody was doing anything wrong. What
Hmm.
it revealed, candidly, is that the organization had quietly normalized a lot of inconsistency in
Hmm.
how expectations were translated.
Okay.
And so, how coaching was documented and how leadership standards were applied. And so, in other words, the process was documented as if it was standardized, Nick,
Mm-hmm.
but in practice, it was highly uneven.
Hmm.
So what automation did, and kind of that visibility exercise and documentation, you started to make visible that you're trying to support a workflow in a structured way. And immediately you see where judgment is clear and where it's fuzzy, and where manager discretion is actually covering the absence of real operating clarity.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that was probably the most important insight throughout the entire exercise. The exercise didn't just, the tool, the automation didn't just improve the workflow,
Hmm.
it exposed where the workflow was never standardized or as standardized as we told ourselves it was,
Yeah,
right?
because yes, things change and you cannot foresee it. Like if you build the process say, 1 year ago, maybe right now folks are just like because the tooling and the ways to do work change so fast that you never actually know. You cannot even foresee. You can build the perfect map right now, but it may be outdated in 6 months because there's been a new way to do the thing. And the employees they
Thousand
have
percent.
found out, yeah, and you
Yeah, I think that, what was really powerful about this exercise was a lack of rigor to align and document standard, right?
hmm. Hmm.
Because again, think about Medicare Advantage. You're changing benefits every single year. Your standard is changing every single year.
Hmm.
So then if you're adding automation or some sort of optimization to that workflow, you have to be clear, like, which version am I now introducing change to? Right. And that was the power of the exercise, because what we thought, this is the latest, this is our most standard workflow,
Hmm.
actually really wasn't.
We have one of our clients in the healthcare, and we did an exercise with them where we went through the process, and we've seen that, let's say, experienced folks they have been solving the process one way, and new folks they were doing it completely the other way. And even more interesting is that even within the experienced team, for the same case, one person was making one decision and another person was making a second decision. So, like going and learning what is the difference in those decisions, in those regulations, was it opened up a lot of insight into how the company was actually performing, what were the operational problems, where the energy or the money or the time was draining. And which also brings me to the next question is you probably know about the situations where there's been an initiative happening a few years ago, and then there's been a whole governance structure built for that process or for that initiative. And then the interest kind of slowed down. The initiative became more of the core operational parts of the company. And then there is this governance structure that nobody even remembers why do we do things like we do. Nobody even knows why is it built like that. So how do you actually work with those kind of governances that have been established years ago? There is some kind of decision principle, but nobody knows why are we doing things like that.
Yeah,
Why do we do that? Like, why are we
right.
doing this process through this route?
100%. And it can be something as benign as leadership change, tooling change, right? And you're just like, what got us here, right? I think it comes down to making decision making better, not more controlled, right?
Hmm.
So, in my opinion and experience, the governance structures that last are the ones that the leaders find useful after the initiative or the crisis is over, if you will. So, if the model if a governance model is only designed to or exists to police people, right? Then they'll abandon it the minute that the urgency is over, or that that leader has now moved on, or we're sunsetting the tool, whatever. But if governance improves things like prioritization, and
Hmm.
it helps clarify ownership, and it increases visibility, and it helps leaders make better trade-offs, better decision making, then it becomes how the organization operates.
Hmm.
This it's not outside of the operational structure,
It has to
right?
integrate, right? That's the main thing. It should be integral
100%.
part, so it doesn't die
100%.
off.
Correct. So, I think the design principle is simply this. You build governance in a way that creates practical value for the people who are going to use it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it should, and if it's not, if you can't answer the questions of like, does this help us think more clearly, right?
Hmm.
Not just behave more carefully, then chances are it probably has staying power. But that it's interesting to me as to what was the catalytic event that created the governance structure in the first place. Because that, to your point, if it isn't, and I love your word, if it's not integrated as just a behavioral norm, then yeah, it's up for debate on the value prop of it.
100%. One of the last questions that I left for the dessert. You mentioned something earlier that technology is often not the main problem why the transformation program fails. So, throughout your career, what were your observations towards what is usually the main reason for the transformation program to fail? And what is the scapegoat for where people tell,
Yeah.
oh, it failed because XYZ?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's an excellent question, and is I would hope would be one of those things that comes out of retrospectives, right? Initiative retrospectives. But I think transformation programs break down at that intersection of ambiguity, initiative, and operating discipline, right? To your point, I don't believe that I believe that technology is rarely the core failure point.
Okay.
I think most often what happens is that the organization most likely isn't truly aligned on what the problem is
Mm-hmm.
or the problem to be solved. Most likely not a level of discipline necessary around what it will take to execute the business case, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And not probably realistic on the capacity that is necessary to execute that change,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly, not willing to change the behaviors that the old system awarded and rewarded,
Mm.
right? What can't be lost in this exercise is the magnificence, my goodness, that would be Pico, the magnificence of and what change really does mean to an organization. I think, candidly, technology a lot of times gets blamed because it's visible.
Mm-hmm.
But the deeper issues are usually structural. Candidly, weak ownership, poor handoff, vague success metrics, lack of readiness, and the leadership wanting outcomes without changing the operating model underneath, right?
Mm-hmm. I see.
So again, to me, and I'm not trying to give a total pass to technology. Again, I think it's an ecosystem opportunity, but I don't think it is solely a technology thing that is the core problem. I just think technology makes the cracks easier to see.
Feels like, at least the way that I explain this to me right now is, let's say you have this map where you have to go from point A to point B, and this is what the leadership is deciding on. Technology is the vehicle that you choose to get
Hmm.
from point A to point B. So a lot of times when you do not get to point B, the vehicle is blamed. But what you are saying is that actually it's a failure to describe this point B very clearly, inability to understand what kind of resources will we need to get to the point B, to draw the picture of the point B for everybody in the company that they will say, all right, from us going into point B is actually more benefiting than staying in point A. So it's all revolving about this point B, this end state, why we're doing this transformation. And then, of course, you need to understand the point B, you need to understand the path, and then you're choosing the right vehicle to get you to that point. But it's not only to say, all right, well, we chose an SUV at the place where we had to choose the helicopter.
Yeah.
Like failure to make the decision comes from you not understanding that you actually have to cross the mountain ridge, and the SUV is not going to be a good fit for that.
Yeah. I mean, and your analogy is brilliant. I think you could even go further left of that and say, do we all align that point B is actually where we want to be?
Yeah.
Right. And what I think is really fascinating that you bring up in this example, Nick, is that transition, that transformation change, that journey is malleable.
Hmm.
So perhaps it isn't point B. The MVP is point C, ultimately getting to point B, right? That's the kind of communication and change arc that happens through these sort of transformations that really are absolutely foundational to ensure that the journey we're all on
Hmm.
is the one that we agree to, even though it can be really uncomfortable at times.
Quote that, frame that, put it on the wall, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Bumper sticker, t-shirts. Yeah, exactly.
It's been amazing. It's been amazing episode and conversation. I learned so much. I'm sure the viewers and listeners, like if anybody wants to reach out to Tamara, I'm gonna tag you everywhere on all the episodes. I'm sure that you won't be against talking with the viewers if they're gonna have the follow-up questions, because
Absolutely.
we just briefly skimmed through, we just whipped the creams off the top of the conversation, but there is so much depth that we could go, and I wish that if we started covering everything, we'd be sitting here for 30 hours.
Yes.
It's been a pure pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to the episode. I'm waiting for some time to record the episode 2, the second version for the podcast. And thank you so much for sharing your insights,
My
your
pleasure.
and your career learnings.
It was wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity, Nick. You have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.